Beyond the Great Wall, where winter freezes breath before it leaves your lips, a drought doomed entire civilizations to extinction. The year was 375 AD, when desperate horsemen crossed the frozen Volga, their composite bows thirsting for blood, their children scarred from birth to welcome pain as a teacher. These weren't ordinary barbarians seeking plunder. They were the Huns, masters of mobile warfare, who could appear like lightning, strike like thunder, and vanish like mist. Under Attila, they would terrorize Europe for decades, demanding tribute from emperors and turning mighty cities into smoking ruins. Their story is the ultimate clash between civilization and the wild steppes that spawned history's most feared warriors. Beyond the wall, where Chinese emperors dream of eternal security, where watchtowers pierce morning sky like stone fingers thrust toward heaven, the grasslands roll endlessly eastward in waves that mirror the sea's own rhythm. Here, beneath horizons so wide they swallow empires whole, the wild earth runs from the Gobi's burning breath to the Caspian's far and salt-stung rim, 3,000 miles of wind-lashed wilderness where strength is the only law and the weak are left as pale relics scattered by the iron storms of winter. The land itself breeds warriors, winters that freeze a man's breath before it leaves his lips, forge children who laugh at hardship, summers that bake the earth to stone, teach riders to find water where civilized men see only death. Springs that flood the grasslands with sudden abundance create horsemen who know that fortune favors the swift, the bold, the utterly ruthless in their pursuit of survival. On these boundless plains, where the horizon shimmers like a mirage and distant mountains float like clouds above the grassland sea, the peoples who will shake the world learn their craft. Boys barely old enough to grip a bow-mount horses before they can properly walk, their small fingers already hardening around reins that will guide them to victories their grandfathers never imagined. Girls who tend the herds develop eyes sharp enough to spot wolves at distances that would humble eagles, their voices carrying commands across valleys that echo with the thunder of 10,000 hooves. The Xiongnu Confederation that once commanded these endless spaces lives on in more than memory. When Modu Chanyu first united the scattered tribes beneath his wolf-tail standard, he created an empire that stretched from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of Central Asia. His armies moved like storms across the landscape, appearing where least expected, striking with lightning speed, vanishing before retaliation could find them. At Pingcheng, his horsemen surrounded Emperor Gaozu's entire army, trapping 200,000 Chinese soldiers in a valley where the bones of their horses still whiten beneath the endless sky. Laoshang Chanyu, son of the great Modu, drives Chinese tribute caravans across the desert every season, their wagons groaning beneath loads of silk and gold that represent the price of peace. Chinese princesses arrive at his court as brides, their tears mixing with the bitter winds that sweep down from the north, as they realize that all their civilization's refinement means nothing to men who measure worth in horses and courage rather than poetry and porcelain. As mare's milk ferments in leather pouches and mutton hisses over dung flames, the children listening to these tales take something far richer than folklore into their hearts. They inherit the cellular memory of conquest, the genetic understanding that walls built by frightened farmers serve only to mark the boundaries of future hunting grounds. When they practice with their small bows, loosing arrows at enemy helmets mounted on stakes, they prepare for destiny, written in the stars that wheel overhead, in patterns their shamans read like sacred texts. Drought comes to the steppes with the inevitability of death and the mercy of neither man nor God. The great drought of 360 brings skies that burn like bronze, empty of clouds, merciless in their clarity. Rivers that ran full the previous spring dwindle to chains of stagnant pools, where desperate animals gather to drink water that tastes of mud and despair. Grass that once stood knee-high to a mounted warrior withers to brittle stubble that crumbles at a horse's touch. The herds begin to die. First, the weakest animals, the old mares whose foaling days have passed, the geldings whose wind has been broken by too many hard winters. Then the young stock, their ribs showing through hides that hang loose as burial shrouds. Finally, even the breeding animals begin to fail, their eyes growing dull as they stand motionless in whatever shade they can find, waiting for an end that comes with the patience of seasons. Families that measured their wealth in thousands of head watch their fortunes evaporate like morning dew. The kumis stops flowing as mares go dry. Cheese wheels that should have lasted through winter crack and spoil in the relentless heat. Children who should grow fat on mare's milk and mutton instead develop the hollow-eyed look of those who know hunger as an intimate companion. Western winds carry rumors more substantial than hope. Traders who venture far from their home. Ranges bring tales of lands beyond the Volga, where rivers never fail, where grass grows thick enough to hide a crouching man, where the very air tastes of moisture and promise. Allen merchants speak of pastures that stretch to the horizon without a single withered blade. Persian dealers describe territories where horse herds grow fat on grass that never knows drought. The composite bows that will terrify civilized armies take shape in workshops where master craftsmen blend horn from aurochs, sinew from elk spines, and wood from mountain birch into instruments of war that surpass anything produced in Chinese arsenals or Roman armories. The horn, heated over fires of dried dung until it bends like heated bronze, stores energy that will drive arrows 400 paces with accuracy that shames the finest archers of settled lands. Bowmakers whose fathers and grandfathers practiced the same deadly artwork through entire seasons to create weapons worthy of warriors who must trust their lives to the tools they carry. The sinew, pounded to silk fine threads by women whose arms grow strong from the endless labor, binds the composite layers with strength that will not fail though the bow sing 10,000 times. Wooden cores cut from heartwood that has weathered decades of steppe storms provide the flexibility that allows these weapons to cast death with surgical precision. The arrows themselves become works of art that deal death with surgical precision. Eagle feathers, plucked from birds caught during their spring migrations over the Altai peaks, provide flights that guide each shaft true to its target. Points forged from iron, mined in the mountains beyond Lake Baikal, pierce armor that would turn aside lesser weapons. The balance achieved between point, shaft, and fletching creates projectiles that fly like extensions of the archer's will, seeking their targets with the inevitability of fate itself. Boys who will someday loose these arrows at Roman legions and Gothic warriors begin their training before their voices change. They learn to draw the heavy bows while mounted on horses that respond to knee pressure alone, leaving their hands free for the deadly work of war. Their targets, straw men dressed in captured Chinese armor, clay pots filled with sheep's blood, live rabbits that must be killed cleanly to avoid waste, teach lessons that no peaceful people could understand. Hun children receive their first ritual scars as soon as they can sit without being held. Heated bronze knives trace careful patterns across young faces, the wounds deliberately kept open with salt and mare's urine until they heal into raised marks that will serve as armor against future pain. Mothers who hold their screaming children during this ceremony whisper that tears are for farmers and slaves, that Hun warriors must learn to welcome pain as a teacher who prepares them for the trials that await. The scars serve purposes beyond mere identification. Children whose faces have been marked with hot bronze develop tolerance for discomfort that will serve them well during the hardships of campaign. They learn that pain has boundaries, that courage consists not in the absence of fear, but in action despite terror. The patterns carved into their flesh become maps that guide them toward the ruthless effectiveness that will make their names whispered curses in the prayers of their enemies. Blood oaths sworn between warriors create bonds that transcend even family loyalty. When young men achieve their first kills in battle against raiders from rival tribes, they mix their blood in cups made from enemy skulls, while speaking words that bind them until death or the world's ending. These ceremonies, witnessed by shamans who call upon the spirits of ancient heroes, create networks of obligation that span the steppes like invisible webs of steel. Those shamans who bridge this world and the world of spirits hold wisdom from before the time of any man alive. Their painted drums, decorated with symbols that encode the secret names of gods, summon powers that can heal the sick, curse enemies, or reveal the hidden paths that lead through seemingly impassable terrain. When they fall into trances induced by fermented mare's milk and sacred mushrooms, they journey to other worlds where the spirits of Modu-Chanyu and Laoshang-Chanyu provide counsel for the living. These holy men and women read signs that guide crucial decisions. When the shaman spreads the steaming entrails of a sacrificed white horse across the felt carpet, seeking guidance for the westward migration, the pattern of blood vessels traces routes that will carry the clans safely through territories controlled by hostile tribes. The liver's color speaks of fortune that awaits beyond the horizon. The heart's condition reveals whether the Sky Father approves of plans that will carry his people toward unknown destinies. Sacred fires that burn continuously in the centers of camps consume more than dried dung and scrub brush. They devour offerings that maintain harmony between the human world and the realm of spirits. When mothers throw locks of their children's hair into flames that carry prayers to the Sky Father, the smoke rises in pillars that connect earth to heaven. Warriors cast portions of captured enemy weapons into these fires, transforming tools of war into gifts that ensure victory in future battles. The great Kurgan mounds that dot the landscape like stone tears shed by the earth itself contain the remains of heroes whose names echo through generations. When the greatest Khans receive sky burial, their bodies exposed on platforms that elevate them closer to the eternal blue. Eagles and vultures carry their essence to join the ancestors who ride eternal hunts across the star fields that wheel overhead each night. Lesser warriors find rest in burial chambers carved from living earth and lined with felt hangings that depict their greatest victories. Their grave goods, weapons whose edges remain sharp after centuries in darkness, horse gear decorated with Chinese gold, ivory ornaments carved by craftsmen whose skills rival those of Alexandria, accompany them on journeys to other worlds where the grass never fails and the hunting never ends. Horses sacrificed at these burials provide mounts for the dead, in realms where speed and endurance matter as much as they do in the world of the living. Through the networks that tie them to distant traders, they gain not just wares, but innovations that will redefine how battles are fought. Chinese crossbow mechanisms inspire improvements in Hun composite bows. Roman cavalry techniques, observed during border skirmishes, suggest modifications to steppe fighting methods. Persian metallurgy, learned through captured craftsmen, enables the creation of weapons that surpass anything their ancestors imagined. The merchants who facilitate these exchanges develop skills that rival those of professional spies. They must understand the customs and taboos of peoples who range from Chinese bureaucrats to Gothic chieftains, speak languages that span continents, navigate political situations that shift as rapidly as weather on the steppes. Their caravans, protected by guards whose loyalty has been purchased with advance payments of horses and gold, carry correspondence between rulers who may never meet face to face, but whose decisions affect the lives of millions. Metallurgy, practiced in hidden forges, produces weapons and tools that surpass the products of more settled civilizations. The smiths who combine spiritual power with technical knowledge create blades that hold edges sharper than obsidian, spear points that pierce any armor, horse gear that will not fail, though subjected to the stresses of constant campaign. The iron they work comes from bog deposits in the northern forests, meteorites that fall from the sky like gifts from the gods themselves. The secret techniques passed from master to apprentice involve ritual as well as craft. Smiths purify themselves with steam baths and fasting before beginning sacred work. They speak incantations over cooling metal that bind protective spirits into weapons that will serve their bearers faithfully. The tempering processes that involve quenching hot steel in mare's urine and wolf's blood create tools with properties that exceed what mere metallurgy could achieve alone. Winter preparations that enable survival during seasons that would kill softer breeds begin before the first snow falls. The great felt makers work frantically to complete the heavy garments that will protect families during months when the wind carries death in its teeth. Hunters range far from camps to secure the meat that must last until spring. Grass enables the herds to recover their strength. Inside the yurts that shelter these people during the harsh months, families gather around central fires that provide light as well as warmth. The portable palaces that can be assembled or dismantled in minutes by experienced crews become centers of education where children learn the genealogies that stretch back to Moduchanyu himself. Adolescents master the crafts that will enable them to survive as independent adults. Adults plan the raids and migrations that will occupy the warmer months ahead. The stories told during these winter nights preserve more than entertainment. They encode the tactical knowledge that enables small forces to defeat larger armies. When the old warriors recount how Moduchanyu trapped Emperor Gaozu at Pingcheng, they describe the precise movements that surrounded 200,000 Chinese soldiers, with forces barely a quarter their size. The feigned retreats that drew cavalry into ambushes, the coordinated charges that shattered infantry formations, the night attacks that turned victories into routs. All these techniques pass from grandfather to grandson through tales that make the dead live again in memory. In these winter gatherings, plans take shape that will guide the year's actions. When clan leaders debate migration routes that will provide adequate grazing while avoiding territories controlled by hostile neighbors, their discussions reveal understanding of logistics and geography that enables coordination across territories larger than most empires. The intelligence they gather through networks that extend from the Arctic Ocean to the Indian Ocean guides decisions that will determine whether families prosper or perish during the crucial months ahead. Marriage negotiations that bind distant clans together create alliances essential for survival during the Great Migration westward. When fathers offer daughters to chiefs whose grazing lands stretch toward the setting sun, the bride prices they negotiate, hundreds of horses, camels, suits of captured armor, reflect calculations that balance affection against political necessity. These unions create bonds stronger than blood between peoples who must trust each other with their lives during the perilous journey that awaits. The diplomatic skills developed through these negotiations prepare participants for the complex relationships they will establish with the settled empires they encounter during their westward movement. The understanding of reciprocal obligation that governs marriage agreements provides templates for tribute arrangements with conquered territories. The The sensitivity to honor and face-saving that makes family alliances successful translates directly to the management of relationships with proud enemies, who must be transformed into cooperative subjects. Hours of winter care keep every blade and bow in prime shape for the battles of spring. Bowstrings crafted from the finest sinew undergo tests that ensure they will not snap when death rides close. Arrow points are sharpened to edges that can penetrate any armor likely to be encountered. Swords receive attention that removes every trace of rust, while blessed oils prevent future corrosion. With their ceremonies, this work shifts from maintenance to sacred ritual. Warriors chant prayers that call upon the spirits of ancient heroes to inhabit their tools of war. Each bow receives individual blessing that acknowledges its unique characteristics and requirements. Arrows are consecrated in groups that will fight together as units, their fates intertwined like those of the men who will loose them. The winter finally breaks with the sound of ice cracking on streams that have slept beneath frozen blankets for months that seemed eternal. Horses that survived on dried grass and stored hay lift their heads to scent the promise carried on winds that no longer bite like wolves. Children who grew during the long confinement emerge from felt cocoons like butterflies. Ready to spread wings they have strengthened through months of preparation. But this spring brings more than the usual awakening. The drought that has withered their ancestral pastures forces decisions that will reshape the world. The westward migration that begins as families pack their portable homes carries with it the accumulated fury of a people who have endured too much hardship and learned too well the arts of war. From the children marked in their first ceremonies will come warriors whose names the civilized dare only whisper. The horses bred through generations of careful selection will carry their riders to victories that echo through the ages. The bows crafted through winters of patient work will loose arrows that topple empires and rewrite the maps of the ancient world. The time of the great wandering approaches, when these riders from the eastern steppes will seek new homes in territories they have known only through tales and visions. The stage is set, the actors have learned their roles through lifetimes of preparation, and the drama that will unfold across continents awaits only the rising of the curtain. Winter grips the Volga with iron fingers in the year 375, transforming the great river into a highway of ice thick enough to bear the weight of armies. Hun scouts venture onto the frozen surface and report back to King Balamber that a man can ride from shore to shore without his horse's hooves touching water. Behind them, the drought-stricken steppes offer only death. Ahead, beyond the white expanse that stretches toward the western horizon, lie the rich grasslands that Alan traders have described in their tales of prosperity. Balamber raises the white horsetail standard that signals the beginning of the crossing. Its silk streamers crack in the wind that sweeps down from the Arctic wastes. Beneath him, his stallion paws the ice with hooves that ring like bronze on the frozen surface. Behind him stretch columns of Hun warriors, whose scarred faces bear witness to years of preparation for this moment. Shamans riding painted ponies shake their bone rattles and chant prayers to guide their people to victory in foreign lands. Across the ice they come, a dark tide of horsemen flowing westward, like the shadow of death itself. Children barely old enough to sit a saddle ride beside veterans whose grey beards are stiff with frost. Women fighters guide pack animals laden with felt yurts and iron cauldrons. Behind them trudge captives taken in border skirmishes, Chinese artisans who will forge weapons, Persian smiths who understand the secrets of steel, Germanic slaves who know the paths through the forests ahead. King Sangiban of the Alans watches this approach from his hilltop stronghold, confident in walls that have never been breached, and soldiers whose heavy cavalry has earned respect from Roman emperors. His cataphracts wait in their armor, men whose fathers and grandfathers have never known defeat. Yet no walls can hold back the tide that sweeps across the frozen Volga, like oil across water, surrounding settlements before defenders realize their danger. Villages that surrender immediately find their inhabitants incorporated into the growing Hun Confederation. Communities that resist discover that mercy is a luxury these eastern invaders cannot afford. At the Battle of the Terek Valley, Sangiban leads his finest fighters in a charge that should have scattered any barbarian host. His cataphracts thunder across the frozen ground with lances leveled, their scale mail gleaming like fish skin in the winter sun. Balamba's response demonstrates the tactical genius that will make Hun warfare legendary. Rather than meeting the charge head-on, his forces divide like water before a stone, flowing around the flanks while maintaining pressure to prevent retreat. Alan lances find only empty air, where solid targets should be, while Hun arrows begin finding gaps in armor designed to stop crude barbarian missiles. Alan horses, bred for power rather than endurance, begin to tire under armored riders, while the steppe ponies maintain their speed with the patience of creatures born to run. Round and round flows the deadly dance. Alan cavalry, seeking to come to grips with enemies who refuse to be pinned down, while Hun archers whittle away their strength with arrows that fall like deadly rain. Sangiban himself dies with a nomadic arrow through his throat, the iron point punching through mail that should have protected his neck. His death sends a shudder through Alan ranks that no battlefield experience can overcome. Soldiers who have never retreated begin edging backward, seeking escape from enemies who strike like lightning and vanish like mist. Retreat becomes rout, then massacre, as the eastern riders catch fleeing cavalry on blown horses. Survivors who escape carry news of disaster to Roman outposts along the Danube. Their reports describe enemies unlike any barbarians the civilized world has encountered. Not crude Germanic tribes seeking plunder, but warfare that combines nomadic mobility with tactical sophistication, rivaling anything taught in military schools. Alan resistance collapses with their king's death. Settlements open their gates to Hun envoys who promise protection for submission. Fighters who battled the invaders find themselves recruited into nomadic ranks, their knowledge of local terrain making them valuable additions. Balamba adopts Alan heavy cavalry techniques that complement traditional steppe tactics. His armored followers provide the shock action needed to break enemy formations that arrows alone cannot shatter. Alan's smiths, working in the camps, forge armor that protects without sacrificing mobility, creating hybrid equipment perfectly suited to the mixed warfare that will characterize these operations throughout Europe. Beyond the Dnieper River, Gothic territories offer richer prizes but greater dangers. King Ermanaric rules an empire stretching from Baltic shores to Black Sea coasts, commanding Gothic warriors whose courage is legendary. His realm represents the greatest concentration of Germanic military power, a potential obstacle that could halt the eastern expansion before it gains momentum. Yet Ermanaric has grown old in his victories, and age brings hesitation to leaders who once struck with eagle's speed. Gothic scouts venture eastward and return with tales of warfare conducted at speeds that leave traditional thinking obsolete. These are not raiders who can be caught and destroyed, but an entire people on the move, carrying families and herds as they sweep westward like a force of nature. Ermanaric summons fighters from territories spanning hundreds of miles, assembling armies whose size should overwhelm any barbarian host. His fortified towns stock provisions for sieges lasting multiple seasons. His smiths work day and night, forging weapons for levies, drawn from every corner of his realm. But these strengths become vulnerabilities when confronting enemies who refuse to fight by established rules. The steppe raiders strike at supply trains before they reach Gothic strongholds, forcing defenders into open country where nomadic advantages prove decisive. Siege preparations become irrelevant when attackers show no interest in capturing fortified positions, preferring to devastate countryside until garrisons surrender from starvation. Gothic cavalry discovers that courage cannot overcome tactical disadvantages created by inferior equipment and training. At the Battle of the Dnieper Crossing, Ermanaric stakes everything on a single engagement that should determine his kingdom's fate. He arrays his strength along the river line, infantry with shields and spears to break mounted charges, cavalry waiting to exploit breaks in enemy formations. Behind them rise standards of a dozen Germanic tribes, whose banners proclaim unity against the common threat from the east. The eastern response demonstrates flexibility that makes nomadic forces nearly impossible to defeat. Rather than accepting battle on Gothic terms, they launch simultaneous crossings at multiple points, forcing defenders to divide their strength while preventing concentration for counterattack. Northern Gothic forces face mounted detachments that appear and disappear like phantoms, striking hard before melting into forests. Southern defenders discover river crossings they thought impossible become child's play for riders, whose horses swim while carrying full equipment. Ermanaric watches his defenses crumble as the mobility of his enemies makes coordination impossible, and their archery makes Gothic tactics suicidal. His infantry dies by hundreds without inflicting significant casualties on foes who refuse to close within spear range. His cavalry charges find empty ground where targets should be, while retreat brings them under fire from bows that shoot from every direction. Rather than face capture and humiliation, Ermanaric chooses death with dignity befitting a Gothic king. Contemporary accounts differ. Some claim he fell upon his sword, others that he died fighting to the last, but all agree his end marked the collapse of the greatest Germanic power east of the Rhine. With their king's death, Gothic resistance fragments into individual bands, seeking survival rather than victory. Gothic refugees stream westward, carrying tales that reach Roman ears with wildfire speed. Their descriptions create panic among populations grown comfortable behind frontier fortifications, suddenly realizing traditional defenses may prove useless against enemies operating by utterly different principles. Some Gothic bands, approximately 100,000 souls, including fighters and families, petition Emperor Valens for permission to cross the Danube and settle within Roman territory. Fritigern leads these refugees, arguing they could provide valuable military service in exchange for protection and settlement rights. His soldiers, seasoned by frontier warfare, would strengthen Roman defenses, while their families would add farmers and craftsmen to provincial populations. Roman officials see opportunities for profit rather than warnings of catastrophe, viewing Gothic desperation as leverage to be exploited. Yet these calculations rest on assumptions the Eastern warfare has rendered obsolete. Gothic refugees carry more than possessions. They bring psychological shock of defeat at enemies' hands whose methods Roman theorists have never encountered. Their presence creates pockets of instability where traditional authority has collapsed, replaced by desperate solidarity of peoples who have lost everything. The pursuing forces reach the Danube frontier and confront Roman border guards for the first time. These encounters, initially limited to skirmishes and probes, provide both sides with their first experience of enemies whose capabilities neither fully understands. Roman soldiers discover their training, and equipment may be inadequate against nomadic fighters whose tactics combine unprecedented mobility with devastating firepower. The steppe leaders studying Roman defenses recognize both strengths and vulnerabilities. Roman discipline and engineering create formidable obstacles for direct assault, but their reliance on fixed positions offers targets for warfare these nomads understand best. Wealth evident in Roman equipment suggests resources that could support expansion for generations if properly managed through tribute rather than destructive conquest. Diplomatic contacts reveal the vast cultural gulf separating nomadic and settled civilizations. Roman negotiators find themselves confronting leaders whose priorities defy conventional analysis. Eastern demands for tribute reflect not greed, but the nomadic understanding that wealth must flow continuously to maintain fighter loyalty based on choice rather than compulsion. Weather during the crossing, winter, provides advantages the invaders exploit ruthlessly. Rivers become highways for forces equipped for operations in conditions immobilizing conventional armies. Forests become death traps for Gothic survivors whose equipment assumes open-field combat. Snow eliminates foraging opportunities that might have enabled prolonged resistance. The logistical capabilities prove superior to settled enemies depending on fixed supplies. Their herds provide food and transportation, moving with the forces, while portable equipment requires no permanent bases. Fighters raised in felt tents adapt easily to conditions exhausting soldiers accustomed to barracks life. Allen military techniques absorbed through conquest enhance capabilities beyond pure steppe warfare. Heavy cavalry charges break formations, creating opportunities for mounted archers to inflict maximum casualties on disordered opponents. Combined arms tactics coordinating different forces multiply effectiveness of armies whose individual components might be inferior to specialized opponents. In the camps beside the Dnieper, former Gothic nobles draw maps in the dirt, sketching Roman fort layouts and supply routes they once knew as allies. Alathius, who served as Ermanaric's ambassador to Constantinople, now describes to Balamber the inner workings of Roman diplomacy, which generals can be bribed, which officials crave advancement, how tribute flows from province to capital. Gothic smiths, who once forged weapons for their own kings, now teach the metalworkers the secrets of Roman armor, creating hybrid equipment that protects without sacrificing the speed that makes nomadic warfare deadly. Village after village bends the knee without bloodshed as word spreads of mercy toward those who submit willingly. Alan chieftains who once served Sangiban find themselves governing the same territories under new masters, their authority intact as long as grain flows eastward to feed the herds. Gothic farmers who expected enslavement discover instead that their new overlords care more about harvest yields than religious practices, leaving Christian priests free to conduct services while shamans perform their own rituals in adjoining sacred groves. When Balamber's son takes Princess Vadamirka as his bride, the Gothic noblewoman brings more than her beauty to the marriage tent. Her father's bloodline stretches back to legendary kings, lending legitimacy to nomadic rule over peoples who measure worth through ancestry. Their children will grow speaking both Gothic and the steppe tongue, understanding Roman customs as well as nomadic traditions, perfectly positioned to serve as bridges between the conquerors and their settled subjects. These royal marriages become schools of statecraft, teaching the nobles the subtle arts of governing diverse peoples through persuasion rather than force alone. By winter 376, the dominion extends from Volga to Danube, encompassing territories never before acknowledging single mastery. Refugees who fled drought have become conquerors, whose influence shapes destiny from Arctic Ocean to Black Sea. Their success demonstrates that steppe advantages, properly applied, can overwhelm even sophisticated settled civilizations. Yet this triumph represents only the beginning. Beyond the Danube lie Roman riches, the greatest prize any barbarian people has contemplated. Skills developed conquering Alania and Gothic territories, techniques perfected through constant warfare, methods evolved governing diverse populations, all have prepared the way for challenges testing capabilities against civilization's ultimate expression. Roman officials, observing from Danubian fortresses, understand they confront threats unlike any their predecessors faced. The barbarians gathering beyond the river possess capabilities traditional defensive methods may prove unable to contain. Coming years will determine whether Roman civilization can adapt quickly enough to survive the storm approaching from the eastern steppes, carrying accumulated fury of peoples with nothing left to lose and everything to gain through conquest. King Uldin rides through the gates of Castra Martis with the severed heads of his enemies hanging from his saddle, their blood still fresh enough to stain the Roman stones beneath his horse's hooves. The Gothic chieftain who dared raid Hun territories swings beside a Gepid war leader foolish enough to test the new masters of the Pontic steppe. Behind Uldin march captives in chains, women whose beauty will grace nomadic tents, children who will grow up speaking the Hun tongue, craftsmen whose skills will serve their conquerors until death claims them. Roman officials wait in their headquarters, trying to maintain dignity, while reports from frontier scouts describe this Hun king as a man who counts tribute in severed heads rather than gold pieces, who measures success by the terror he inspires, rather than the treaties he signs. Through narrow windows, they watch Hun warriors water their horses in the Danube, their composite bows never far from their hands, even in this moment of apparent peace. Uldin dismounts with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle, his scarred face bearing witness to decades of warfare that have carved an empire from the chaos following Gothic collapse. His clothing combines the practical leather of the steppes with captured Roman silk, Gothic amber, and Allan gold work, a living display of conquered peoples whose wealth now flows towards steppe treasuries. When he negotiates, his demands demonstrate understanding that these are not conventional barbarians seeking mere plunder. The tribute system that Uldin establishes becomes legendary among the frontier garrisons. Hun horsemen demonstrate their skills by galloping past targets set at impossible distances, their arrows striking with mechanical precision despite the thundering chaos of the charge. They practice the feigned retreats that have destroyed so many enemies, wheeling away from imperial positions before turning to loose volleys that would devastate any force foolish enough to pursue. Children barely old enough to draw a bow participate alongside veterans whose grey beards stream in the wind. Imperial commanders who witness these displays realize that traditional Roman tactics, the disciplined infantry formations, the engineering prowess, the logistical superiority that conquered the Mediterranean world, may prove inadequate against enemies who fight according to utterly different rules. These Hun warriors treat warfare as a way of life rather than a temporary interruption of peace. Their entire society organized around the assumption that conflict provides both survival and prosperity. Uldin's forces spread across the valley beyond the fortress, appearing and disappearing behind hills, emerging from forests, materializing from morning mist with the unsettling inevitability of nightmares made flesh. Every attempt at counting yields different results as more riders appear from directions that seemed empty moments before. The eastern forces flow like water across the landscape, their numbers impossible to calculate with any precision. The tribute negotiations that follow establish patterns that will govern relations for generations. Uldin demands not merely gold, but specific weights and purities that demonstrate his understanding of imperial monetary systems. His head-counting method proves grimly effective. For every pound of gold withheld, he promises to deliver 10 barbarian heads to the frontier, taken from tribes that dare threaten imperial lands. The mathematics of terror become diplomacy conducted in the currency of fear. Emperor Honorius, safe behind the walls of Ravenna, reads reports of these negotiations with the growing understanding that his empire confronts challenges unlike any faced by his predecessors. The steppe warfare combines the mobility that makes pursuit impossible with the coordination that makes defense futile. Their demands for tribute reflect not mere greed, but sophisticated understanding of imperial wealth and the pressure points where application of force yields maximum political advantage. The Pannonian Basin becomes the beating heart of Eastern power, its fertile plains providing winter pastures for herds that number in the hundreds of thousands, while its strategic location offers access to trade routes connecting northern Europe with the Mediterranean world. Here, where the Danube bends southward toward the Black Sea, Uldin establishes the administrative center that will evolve into the capital of the greatest nomadic empire the world has ever seen. Control over these lands demonstrates mastery of governing techniques that blend steppe flexibility with settled administrative necessities. Existing Roman settlements continue functioning under new management that diverts their production toward feeding the armies rather than imperial coffers. Germanic tribes that once raided Roman territories find themselves serving as auxiliary forces in campaigns directed by Eastern strategic vision rather than their own ambitions for plunder. The Siri, fierce Germanic warriors whose home territories border the domains, discover that resistance brings only destruction, while cooperation offers opportunities for advancement within the expanding confederation. Their king, Edeko, becomes one of Uldin's most trusted lieutenants, his intimate knowledge of imperial border defenses making him invaluable for planning raids that strike with surgical precision at targets offering maximum profit for minimum risk. Gepid settlements scattered across the Hungarian plains surrender without bloodshed when envoys arrive with offers that combine reasonable terms with unmistakable threats. Their farmers continue tilling fields that have fed their families for generations, but now a portion of each harvest travels eastward to support herds during the lean months of winter. Their young men join mixed formations, where Germanic infantry tactics combine with steppe archery to create capabilities neither could achieve alone. Alan survivors from Sangiban's defeated kingdom find new homes in these lands, where their heavy cavalry traditions merge with steppe mobility to produce hybrid warfare techniques that confound imperial theorists. These Iranian-speaking horsemen bring with them metallurgical knowledge that improves weapon quality, while their understanding of siege warfare enables attacks on fortified positions that pure steppe tactics could never overcome. Uldin's court becomes a cosmopolitan center where languages from across the known world echo through felt-covered halls that serve as throne rooms for the master of half a continent. Chinese artisans captured during border raids forge weapons that combine Eastern techniques with Western materials. Persian merchants who venture into these domains find markets for exotic goods among nobles whose wealth rivals that of senators. Germanic scribes who learned Latin in imperial schools now serve administrators who require written records for governing diverse populations. The seasonal migrations that characterize steppe lifestyle adapt to accommodate the administrative necessities of ruling settled populations. Summer campaigns that once focused purely on raiding evolve into systematic conquests that expand the boundaries of controlled regions. Winter encampments transform from mere survival shelters into centers of learning, where tactical innovations develop through constant experimentation and refinement. Young nobles who grow up during this period of expansion receive educations that prepare them for governing an empire whose complexity surpasses anything their ancestors imagined. They learn to speak Gothic for communicating with Germanic subjects, Latin for negotiating with imperial officials, and various Alan dialects for commanding the heavy cavalry units that provide shock action in major battles. Their understanding of diverse traditions enables tactical flexibility that keeps enemies constantly off balance. Marriage alliances negotiated during winter assemblies create bonds that strengthen political control while incorporating useful bloodlines into the ruling elite. When Ulden's nephew takes a Gepid princess as his bride, the union brings not merely diplomatic advantages, but access to Germanic ironworking techniques that improve weapon quality. Their children inherit claims to leadership in both societies, creating bridges between different ways of life. Religious practices evolve to accommodate the spiritual needs of diverse subject populations, while maintaining shamanic traditions at the center of official ceremonies. Christian Goths continue worshipping in their wooden churches, while fire altars burn continuously in nearby sacred groves. Persian fire worship and Germanic tree veneration find places within an expanding pantheon that grows more inclusive with each conquered region. The diplomatic skills required for managing these complex relationships prepare leaders for negotiations with imperial officials whose sophistication previously intimidated barbarian chieftains. Ulden's envoys who arrive at courts speak fluent Latin, understand legal concepts, and negotiate with subtlety that would credit professional diplomats. Their demands, while backed by obvious strength, reflect careful analysis of political and economic vulnerabilities. Trade networks that develop under oversight create prosperity that benefits conquerors and conquered alike. Germanic amber travels eastward toward Asian markets, while Chinese silk flows westward to adorn nobles and their favored subjects. Gold obtained through tribute payments finances expansion that brings new regions and their resources under central control. The wealth that accumulates in treasuries enables construction projects and expenditures on scales that rival imperial ambitions. Organization during this formative period establishes the foundation for armies that will terrorize civilized Europe for the next century. Tribal levies that began as desperate refugees transform into professional forces whose multi-ethnic composition provides capabilities no single people could match. Gothic heavy infantry provides anvils against which hammer blows can shatter enemy formations. Gepid engineers contribute siege techniques that enable attacks on fortified positions. Siri scouts provide intelligence about imperial movements and vulnerabilities. The head-counting system that Ulden employs for calculating tribute demonstrates understanding of psychological warfare as an instrument of policy. Officials who witness the delivery of promised heads understand viscerally that these are not conventional barbarians who can be managed through traditional diplomatic methods. The terror that these displays inspire creates political pressure within imperial society for accommodation rather than confrontation. Intelligence networks established during this period provide leaders with detailed information about capabilities, political divisions, and economic weaknesses. Germanic nobles who transfer their allegiance bring knowledge of administrative systems, while captured soldiers reveal details about organization and tactical doctrine. This intelligence enables planning that exploits vulnerabilities with precision that appears almost supernatural to contemporary observers. settlement patterns that emerge in conquered regions reflect understanding that successful expansion requires more than victory. Existing populations who submit peacefully find their lives disrupted as little as possible, with traditional authority structures retained under overall oversight. Agricultural production continues under management that ensures adequate supplies for both local consumption and the support of armies. Cultural synthesis that develops during these decades creates new forms of artistic expression that combine influences from across the known world. Metalworkers learn Germanic decorative techniques while retaining steppe traditions of animal representation. Textile production incorporates imperial dyes, Chinese silk, and felt making to create garments that proclaim the cosmopolitan character of society. Music and poetry evolve to celebrate victories that span continents and heroes whose achievements transcend traditional ethnic boundaries. Seasonal campaigns during Ulden's reign demonstrate the tactical innovations that make armies nearly invincible against conventional opposition. Spring raids that strike before forces complete their mobilization, capture supplies and prisoners, while avoiding costly battles against prepared defenses. Summer operations that coordinate multiple columns confuse enemy responses while maximizing gains. Autumn attacks that target harvest storage deprive opponents of resources needed for winter survival. The logistics that support these operations reveal mastery of supply techniques perfectly adapted to their lifestyle. Horse herds that travel with forces provide both transportation and emergency rations. Captured livestock supplements diet, while portable equipment eliminates dependence on fixed supply bases. The mobility that results enables forces to appear where least expected, while vanishing before effective retaliation becomes possible. By the opening years of the 5th century, dominion stretches from the Volga to the Rhine, encompassing regions that include some of the richest agricultural areas in Europe. The confederation that Ulden governs from his Pannonian headquarters commands resources that rival those available to emperors, while maintaining the flexibility that makes societies nearly impossible to defeat through conventional means. Yet this success creates new challenges, as the expanding empire encounters limits imposed by geography, logistics, and the growing sophistication of enemies who adapt their tactics to counter advantages. Defensive preparations focus increasingly on mobility and harassment rather than static fortifications. Tribes that remain independent seek alliances that could provide collective security against expansion. The stage is set for conflicts that will test capabilities against increasingly organized opposition. The death of Uldin in 412 creates succession disputes that reveal both the strengths and weaknesses of political systems. Multiple claimants emerge, each supported by different tribal factions and each offering alternative visions of future development. The confederation that seemed unshakable under unified leadership fragments temporarily as various groups pursue independent policies that sometimes conflict with overall strategic interests. Resolution of these conflicts through a combination of warfare, negotiation, and assassination eventually produces joint leadership under Attila and his brother Bleda, whose complementary skills and shared vision restore unity while preparing for the greatest expansion in history. Their inheritance includes not merely control, but the accumulated expertise, diplomatic experience, and administrative capabilities that their predecessors developed through decades of expansion and experimentation. The foundation is laid. The instruments of conquest have been forged through constant warfare and refined through bitter experience. The wealth necessary for sustaining major campaigns has been accumulated through successful tribute collection and expansion. The stage awaits the emergence of leaders whose vision encompasses not merely regional dominance, but the reshaping of the entire balance of power between civilizations. Brothers Attila and Bleda ascend to power in 434, like twin eagles seizing the same prey, their joint rule marking the moment when Hun ambitions expand beyond regional dominance toward reshaping the entire balance of civilized Europe. The younger Attila burns with the fierce intelligence of one born to command empires, while his elder brother, Bleda, possesses the diplomatic cunning necessary for managing relationships with powers that still consider themselves equals to Hun kings. Together, they inherit an empire that stretches from the Volga to the Rhine, commanding resources that rival those of Roman emperors, while maintaining the mobility that makes Hun armies nearly invincible. Negotiations at Margus in 435 demonstrate how thoroughly these Hun leaders understand the pressure points where applied force yields maximum diplomatic advantage. Emperor Theodosius II, secure behind the walls of Constantinople, discovers that his gold-heavy treasury makes him vulnerable to demands that grow larger with each successful payment. The Hun brothers arrive at the negotiating table with £2,100 of Roman gold as their opening price, double the tribute paid to their predecessors, while their implied threats carry the weight of armies that have never known defeat. Speaking with measured precision, Attila demonstrates that he has studied his enemies as carefully as a hunter studies prey. His demands encompass not merely tribute payments, but specific requirements for the exchange of fugitives, establishment of exclusive markets for Hun merchants, and recognition of territorial claims that push Hun boundaries deeper into lands the empire considers its own. When Roman negotiators attempt to reduce these demands through traditional diplomatic bargaining, they discover that Hun patience has limits measured in days rather than months. Markets that open under these agreements transform frontier regions into centers of exchange where Roman gold flows eastward, while Hun goods penetrate imperial territories with the inevitability of floodwaters seeking lower ground. Eastern merchants who once struggled to find buyers for their horses and furs now command premium prices from customers who understand that these suppliers possess political protection extending to the highest levels of barbarian leadership. Profits from these transactions fill tribal treasuries while creating vested interests in peaceful relations among populations that might otherwise support renewed warfare. Yet peace proves as temporary as morning frost beneath the summer sun. Imperial officials who promise compliance with treaty terms discover that enforcing these agreements against populations unwilling to harbor fugitives creates administrative difficulties that cascade through multiple levels of government. When imperial commanders along the Danube frontier fail to deliver promised refugees, they provide the king with justifications for raids that strike with surgical precision at targets offering maximum political impact with minimal military risk. Bishop of Margus learns this lesson when steppe raiders appear outside his city walls, demanding the surrender of fugitives rumored to be hiding within church sanctuaries. His attempts to negotiate safe passage for these refugees while maintaining ecclesiastical neutrality collapse when the forces demonstrate that theological arguments carry little weight against composite bows and cavalry charges. Gold treasures of his cathedral disappear eastward along with the fugitives, while the bishop himself survives only through the intervention of citizens who purchase his life with information about defensive preparations. Bleda's death in 445 removes the last restraint on Attila's ambitions, while eliminating the only voice within leadership councils that consistently advocated caution over conquest. Contemporary sources differ on circumstances. Some claim accident during a hunting expedition. Others whisper of fratricide disguised as misfortune. But all agree that the elder brother's demise leaves Attila as sole master of forces that have grown restless under treaty limitations. Funeral ceremonies that follow become celebrations of renewed expansion, rather than mere mourning for the departed. Palace complex constructed in the Pannonian heartland reflects both wealth accumulated through successful tribute collection and aesthetic sensibilities of a ruler who appreciates simplicity over ostentation. Wooden buildings whose clean lines and functional arrangements contrast sharply with marble excess of imperial architecture. House administrative centers where correspondence arrives from kingdoms spanning 3 continents. Great hall where Attila holds court accommodates thousands of warriors while maintaining acoustic properties that allow a single voice to reach listeners throughout the massive structure. Foreign visitors who attend assemblies discover that court ceremonies blend steppe traditions with innovations adapted from conquered civilizations. Attila himself sits upon carved wood rather than golden throne, his clothing distinguished by quality rather than ornament, his meals served on wooden plates that proclaim connection to nomadic ancestors, while silver goblets of his guests acknowledge their subordinate status. Messages these arrangements convey transcend mere protocol. Here rules a man who commands through demonstrated competence rather than inherited privilege. Logistics required to maintain this court reveal organizational capabilities that rival those of established empires. Supplies that feed thousands of daily visitors arrive through networks extending from the Atlantic Ocean to the Black Sea. Herds that provide meat and milk for royal hospitality graze on pastures managed with scientific precision to prevent overuse while ensuring adequate nutrition. Scribes who record administrative decisions work in languages ranging from Latin to Chinese, their multilingual capabilities enabling correspondence with rulers whose domains touch the borders of the known world. Marriage alliances negotiated from this center create kinship bonds that strengthen political relationships while incorporating useful bloodlines into the ruling family. When Attila takes princesses from conquered Germanic tribes as wives, these unions produce children who inherit claims to leadership among both nomadic and settled populations. Diplomatic advantages that result from these relationships enable negotiations with tribal leaders who might otherwise view authority as alien domination rather than legitimate governance. Intelligence networks operating from the palace provide the ruler with detailed information about Roman political divisions, economic vulnerabilities, and defensive preparations. Merchants who travel under protection gather information about grain harvests, troop movements, and construction projects while conducting legitimate business throughout imperial territories. Germanic nobles who transfer their allegiance contribute knowledge about administrative methods and diplomatic customs that enables more effective planning for future operations. Scythian's sword that legend claims Attila discovered provides a powerful symbol for rallying tribal support around leadership, while lending supernatural sanction to political authority. Whether this blade represents genuine archaeological find or clever political theatre matters less than its psychological impact on populations who interpret such discoveries as divine approval for earthly ambitions. Ceremonies surrounding this weapon's public display transform simple assemblies into religious experiences that bind participants together through shared witness of miraculous events. Administrative systems that develop demonstrate sophisticated understanding of challenges involved in governing diverse populations across vast distances. Regional governors appointed for competence rather than birth, carry royal commands to territories where local customs must be balanced against imperial requirements, tax collection that adapts traditional tribute practices to needs of settled communities, creates revenue streams that support both nomadic armies and infrastructure projects needed for governing sedentary subjects. Multilingual character of court administration reflects the cosmopolitan nature of an empire that encompasses dozens of ethnic groups and linguistic traditions. Scribes trained in classical Latin correspond with imperial officials, while others versed in Germanic dialects communicate with tribal leaders whose support remains essential for maintaining control over frontier regions. Documents that record legal decisions and administrative policies exist in multiple versions that address same issues using cultural frameworks appropriate for different audiences. Religious tolerance that characterizes governance enables peaceful coexistence between Christian, pagan, and shamanic traditions without requiring theological compromise from any group. Churches continue functioning under royal protection, while sacred groves where shamans perform traditional ceremonies receive equal respect from imperial authorities. This pragmatic approach to spiritual diversity creates stability in conquered territories, while avoiding conflicts that could drain resources better devoted to expansion and defense. Military innovations that emerge during consolidation combine traditional steppe tactics with techniques learned from conquered enemies. Mounted archers maintain their devastating effectiveness, while incorporating heavy cavalry charges that break enemy formations through shock action rather than missile warfare. Siege engines, operated by Gothic and Imperial engineers, enable attacks on fortified positions that pure nomadic methods could never overcome. Armies that result from this synthesis possess capabilities that no single military tradition could match. Training programs that prepare young warriors for service in these mixed forces teach skills ranging from traditional archery to operation of complex siege machinery. Boys who learn to shoot from horseback also master coordination, required for infantry combat in situations where terrain prevents mounted operations. Versatility that results from this comprehensive education creates soldiers capable of adapting their tactics to whatever conditions they encounter during campaigns that may span years and cover thousands of miles. Diplomatic revolution that accompanies the rise to sole authority transforms relations from crude tribute collection into sophisticated political manipulation that exploits imperial weaknesses with surgical precision. Ambassadors who arrive at Constantinople understand not merely what they want to achieve, but how bureaucratic systems function and where pressure applied at specific points can produce desired results throughout the entire administrative structure. Economic warfare that supplements traditional military pressure demonstrates understanding that political objectives can often be achieved more efficiently through commercial disruption than battlefield victory. Trade routes that previously carried goods safely through territories face increasing tolls and regulatory obstacles that make merchants dependent on nomadic goodwill for maintaining profitable operations. Wealth that flows toward treasuries through these methods funds military preparations while creating powerful incentives for peaceful cooperation among populations that might otherwise support resistance movements. Cultural synthesis that develops during this period creates new forms of artistic expression that reflect the multinational character of empire. Metalworkers who combine Germanic decorative techniques with steppe animal motifs produce objects that proclaim both local identity and imperial unity. Textile production that incorporates silk from China, dyes from Persia, and wool from European sheep creates garments that display global reach of commercial networks while maintaining distinctly nomadic aesthetic sensibilities. Great hunts organized serve purposes beyond mere entertainment, providing opportunities for military training, diplomatic negotiations, and reinforcement of social hierarchies through competitive displays of skill. Warriors who distinguish themselves during these expeditions earn advancement within tribal rankings, while foreign guests observe demonstrations of capabilities that carry implicit warnings about consequences of political opposition. Legal reforms that establish consistent judicial procedures throughout territories create frameworks for resolving disputes between subjects from different cultural backgrounds while maintaining overall imperial authority. Courts that apply customary law to nomadic populations operate alongside tribunals that use imperial principles for governing settled communities. Flexibility inherent in these arrangements prevents conflicts that might otherwise arise from cultural misunderstandings, while ensuring that ultimate authority remains with leadership. Settlement policies that encourage voluntary migration from overcrowded regions to territories where labor shortages limit agricultural productivity create prosperity that benefits both natives and newcomers, while strengthening political bonds throughout the empire. Families that relocate under auspices receive land grants, livestock, and tools that enable successful farming, while their children grow up speaking multiple languages and understanding diverse cultural traditions. By 445, sole rule commands an empire whose population includes millions of subjects from dozens of ethnic groups, whose armies combine military traditions of multiple civilizations, and whose wealth rivals that of Rome itself. Foundation laid during this decade of consolidation provides resources and capabilities needed for campaigns that will test strength against ultimate expressions of civilized military power, set for conflicts that will determine whether nomadic advantages can overcome defensive preparations of enemies who have used years of peace to study methods and develop countermeasures designed specifically to neutralize steppe superiority. Smoke rises from burning Nisus like a black pillar connecting earth to heaven, its column visible for 20 miles across the Danubian plains, where Roman garrisons watch their nightmares made manifest. Attila's siege engines, catapults and battering rams, operated by captured Roman engineers who work under threat of death, pound the ancient city's walls with stones that shatter masonry built to last centuries. For the first time in Hun warfare, enemy fortifications crumble, not through starvation, but through direct assault, marking a revolution in Hun capabilities that will reshape the balance of power between settled and wandering peoples. Nessus demonstrates how Hun military innovation has evolved beyond traditional steppe tactics to incorporate techniques learned from conquered enemies and captured specialists. Roman prisoners who once designed fortifications for imperial armies now apply their engineering knowledge to breaching defenses they understand intimately. Gothic craftsmen, whose ancestors built walls to keep nomads out, now construct siege towers that enable nomads to climb over those same barriers. The irony is lost on none of the participants, least of all Attila, who watches from his mobile command post as the city that once seemed impregnable burns like a funeral pyre. Hun forces that surge through the breached walls demonstrate the systematic thoroughness that characterizes Attila's approach to conquest. Unlike earlier raids that focused purely on plunder, this campaign aims at complete elimination of resistance through terror, so absolute that neighboring cities will surrender without requiring similar treatment. Civilians who might have expected enslavement find themselves facing execution instead, their deaths serving as messages to populations throughout the Balkans that traditional Roman protection no longer exists. Sirmium falls next, its defenders overcome not by assault, but by the psychological impact of refugees streaming from Nisus, with tales of horrors that exceed the worst nightmares of civilized imagination. Hun cavalry that appears outside the city gates finds them already open, Their guards fled, and their population in full panic. Wealth accumulated in this prosperous trading center. Gold from Dacian mines, silk from Asian merchants, amber from Baltic coasts, flows into Hun treasuries, while the city's administrative records provide intelligence about Roman defensive preparations throughout the region. Philippopolis surrenders after a siege lasting barely 3 days, its walls intact, but its defenders demoralized by reports that no relief force will march from Constantinople to their aid. Attila's negotiating terms reveal the sophisticated understanding of political psychology that makes him as dangerous in diplomacy as on the battlefield. The city's population receives safety in exchange for complete submission, while its ruling class must provide hostages whose lives guarantee continued cooperation. The precedent established here: surrender brings mercy, resistance brings annihilation, spreads throughout the empire faster than the Hun armies themselves. Emperor Theodosius II watches these conquests from behind the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, his advisors calculating that even Attila cannot breach fortifications designed by the finest military engineers of their age. Yet the Hun king shows no interest in testing his forces against the imperial capital's defenses, preferring instead to ravage the countryside that feeds the city while extracting tribute payments that grow larger with each passing month. Gold that flows from imperial treasuries to Hun camps demonstrates that walls, however mighty, cannot protect an empire whose economic foundation crumbles under nomadic pressure. Imperial attempts to organize resistance collapse when potential allies discover that intelligence networks have penetrated every level of administration. Messages sent between governors find their way to Attila's headquarters before reaching their intended recipients. Plans for coordinated defensive action become tools for military planning, as captured correspondence reveals Roman weaknesses and divisions. The very sophistication of imperial communications becomes a liability when those communications fall into enemy hands, equipped to exploit them effectively. Tribute negotiations of 447 established the nomadic leader as master of a terror so absolute that even emperors negotiate from positions of desperate weakness rather than confident strength. Steppe demands that exceed anything previously imagined: 6,000 pounds of gold, immediately, plus annual payments of 2,100 pounds, reflect not mere greed, but calculated political psychology, designed to demonstrate imperial impotence to populations throughout the civilized world. Gold that purchases temporary peace also funds military preparations for campaigns that will dwarf anything yet attempted by nomadic peoples. Yet attention turns westward, not through satisfaction with eastern victories, but through recognition that the ultimate prizes lie beyond the Rhine, where Gaul's fertile provinces support populations that have grown wealthy through generations of peace. Roman Gaul represents everything that nomadic conquerors dream of: rich cities, productive farmland, and accumulated treasure that could sustain empire building on scales never before imagined. The challenge lies not in wanting these territories, but in defeating the military forces that protect them. Eastern preparations for Western expansion reveal logistical capabilities that rival those of the greatest imperial armies. Supply trains that stretch for miles carry provisions calculated to sustain 300,000 warriors and their horses during campaigns that may last entire seasons. Portable forges enable weapon maintenance and repair in territories where local resources may prove inadequate. Engineering equipment necessary for siege warfare travels in wagons specially designed for rapid assembly and deployment against targets that may offer only brief windows of vulnerability. Diplomatic contacts established with Germanic tribes throughout Gaul create opportunities for alliances that could multiply effectiveness while dividing potential opposition. Frankish kingdoms, whose territories border imperial provinces, receive envoys bearing gifts and promises of shared plunder. Burgundian nobles, whose lands have been reduced by expansion, find themselves courted by representatives of powers that understand their grievances and offer redress through conquest. The political map of Gaul begins shifting before the first warrior crosses the Rhine. Spring of 451 witnesses the greatest nomadic invasion in European history, as the king leads his confederated armies across the river that has served as a boundary between civilization and barbarian chaos since Caesar's time. Cavalry forms the core of forces that include Ostrogothic heavy infantry, Gepid engineers, Allan-mounted archers, and Frankish auxiliaries whose local knowledge enables rapid movement through territories their enemies thought impassable. The diversity of this host reflects genius for incorporating useful elements from every conquered culture while maintaining overall strategic unity. Imperial response to this invasion demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of defensive systems when confronted by enemies who refuse to fight according to established conventions. General Flavius Aetius, the last competent commander in Gaul, recognizes that traditional tactics, fortified positions, supply line warfare, static defense, will prove useless against forces whose mobility makes conventional military thinking obsolete. His solution involves alliances with Germanic kingdoms whose survival depends on stopping expansion before it overwhelms all organized resistance. Visigothic King Theodoric agrees to joint action not from love of Rome, but from recognition that success in Gaul would eliminate the independence his people have carved from the chaos of imperial collapse. His warriors, seasoned by generations of conflict with both imperial forces and other Germanic tribes, provide the heavy infantry that armies lack, while his political authority enables coordination between traditionally hostile peoples. The coalition that emerges from these negotiations represents the last organized resistance capable of challenging supremacy in Western Europe. Burgundian participation in this alliance demonstrates how completely the threat of domination reshapes traditional political relationships throughout Gaul. Kingdoms that have spent generations fighting expansion now march alongside imperial armies against enemies whose victory would eliminate their existence as independent entities. The irony that barbarians fight to preserve civilization against other barbarians escapes none of the participants, who understand that survival requires temporary suspension of ancient grudges. Frankish divisions reveal the complexity of Germanic responses to expansion, with different tribal factions choosing opposite sides based on calculations that balance immediate survival against long-term advantage. Some Frankish kingdoms join the coalition in hopes of sharing the plunder that conquest will bring. Others ally with Rome and the Visigoths from recognition that victory would reduce all Germanic peoples to the status of subject tribes rather than independent allies. These divisions within Frankish society reflect similar splits throughout Gaul, as communities choose sides in what many recognize as the decisive struggle for European supremacy. Armies that converge on the Catalonian plains in June 451 represent more than mere military forces. They embody competing visions of Europe political organization that will determine the continent's future for centuries to come. Eastern forces advocate a model based on nomadic confederation, where diverse peoples serve unified leadership while maintaining their essential cultural characteristics. Imperial Visigothic allies defend a system based on territorial kingdoms, where fixed boundaries separate independent but cooperating political entities. The nomadic ruler's pre-battle speech to his assembled commanders demonstrates the rhetorical skills that have enabled him to maintain unity among allies whose natural inclinations run toward mutual hostility. He reminds Ostrogothic nobles that civilization once enslaved their ancestors and would do so again, given opportunity. He tells Gapid warriors that Visigothic kingdoms occupy territories their people once called home. He promises Frankish auxiliaries that victory will restore Germanic supremacy over lands their forefathers conquered from legions centuries earlier. Night before battle witnesses ceremonies that blend the religious traditions of a dozen different peoples into synthesized rituals designed to invoke divine favor for the coming struggle. Steppe shamans sacrifice white horses, while Germanic priests offer cattle to war gods whose names echo across the plains in languages ranging from Gothic to Frankish. Christian prayers rise alongside pagan incantations, as allied forces seek supernatural assistance for earthly ambitions that transcend traditional cultural boundaries. Dawn breaks over the battlefield to reveal armies whose size and diversity surpass anything previously assembled in European warfare. Imperial historians estimate total forces at over 500,000 warriors, though the accuracy of such figures remains questionable given the chaos and confusion that characterize ancient battle accounts. What cannot be questioned is the strategic significance of a confrontation that will determine whether nomadic or settled civilizations dominate the future development of European political organization. Tactical deployment reflects understanding that this battle differs fundamentally from previous conflicts, where mobility and surprise provided decisive advantages. The open plains that surround the battlefield offer little opportunity for the feigned retreats and flanking maneuvers that have characterized victories throughout the expansion westward. Instead, this engagement will test abilities to coordinate diverse forces in direct confrontation against enemies equally determined and arguably better equipped for sustained combat. The Great King positions his most reliable troops, cavalry and Ostrogothic infantry, in the center where they can respond rapidly to developments anywhere along the battle line. Allan mounted archers hold the left wing, where their mobility can exploit any breakthroughs achieved by the central assault. Gepid engineers operate siege equipment positioned to provide supporting fire during the initial phases of engagement. Deployment demonstrates sophisticated understanding of combined arms tactics that incorporates lessons learned from decades of warfare against multiple enemy types. Imperial Visigothic deployment reflects Aetius's recognition that victory requires preventing forces from achieving the coordination that makes their diverse coalition so dangerous. He positions Visigothic heavy infantry in the center, where they can absorb and blunt the main assault, while legions hold the flanks where their discipline and training provide maximum advantage against less organized opposition. The tactical concept focuses on breaking unity by forcing allied contingents to fight as separate entities, rather than coordinated components of unified strategy. Battle begins before dawn, with skirmishing between opposing cavalry forces that seek to disrupt enemy formations and identify weak points suitable for exploitation during the main engagement. Mounted archers probe Visigothic lines, while Germanic horsemen test the strength and responsiveness of defensive positions. These preliminary exchanges establish the pattern that will characterize the entire day. Fluid combat where temporary advantages shift rapidly between opposing sides without producing decisive breakthroughs. King Theodoric dies early in the fighting, when Ostrogothic lancers break through Visigothic defenses and overwhelm the royal bodyguard through sheer weight of numbers. His death sends shockwaves through allied ranks that threaten to collapse resistance, just as the battle reaches its critical phase. Yet Visigothic discipline holds firm as Prince Thorismund assumes command, and rallies his father's warriors around the royal standard that continues flying despite the personal tragedy that has befallen the ruling family. Casualties mount steadily as the battle develops into the kind of sustained combat that favors enemies with superior defensive equipment and positional advantages. Nomadic tactics that depend on mobility prove less effective in melee situations, where Gothic shields and armor provide protection that arrows cannot penetrate consistently. The very diversity that gives forces strategic flexibility becomes a tactical liability when coordination breaks down under pressure of desperate combat. Fighting continues throughout the day, with neither side able to achieve the breakthrough that would collapse enemy resistance and transform battle into pursuit of fleeing opponents. Forces that penetrate Allied lines find themselves isolated and eventually overwhelmed by counterattacks that exploit their distance from supporting units. Allied advances into positions meet similar fates, as mobility enables rapid concentration against exposed formations that advance too far beyond their own support. Darkness ends combat that has produced enormous casualties without decisive victory for either side, leaving both armies bloodied but intact and capable of renewing fighting when dawn returns. The decision to withdraw during the night reflects not defeat, but recognition that continued combat under these conditions will destroy forces without achieving objectives that justify such losses. The strategic situation has changed fundamentally. Expansion westward has reached its practical limits against opposition, prepared to pay any price for preventing domination of Gaul. Aftermath of the battle reveals the extent to which this engagement has altered the balance of power throughout Western Europe. Eastern forces remain formidable and capable of renewed aggression, but their aura of invincibility has been shattered by evidence that proper preparation and unified resistance can halt expansion. Imperial Germanic cooperation has proved viable despite centuries of mutual hostility, creating precedents for future alliances that will shape European development long after the great ruler's death. Yet the war continues. Withdrawal from Gaul does not represent abandonment of expansionist ambitions, but rather strategic redeployment toward targets that offer better prospects for success. Italy beckons beyond the Alpine passes, its wealthy cities and fertile plains promising rewards that could compensate for the frustrations experienced in Gallic campaigns. The stage is set for final acts in the drama that will determine whether nomadic civilization can establish permanent dominance over the settled peoples of Europe. Alpine passes that have guarded Italy since Rome's founding echo with the thunder of hooves as Attila leads his armies through mountain defiles where glacial winds cut like knives and the air grows thin enough to kill the unprepared. Behind him march Hun forces, reduced by the casualties of Gaul, but hardened by that struggle into instruments of war, more terrible than any Europe has seen. Hun cavalry rides alongside Gothic infantry, whose shields bear the scars of a dozen battles, while Gepid engineers drag siege equipment through passes where Hannibal once led elephants toward the Eternal City. Spring of 452 witnesses, the impossible becoming reality as Hun armies emerge from Alpine valleys into the fertile Po plain, where Italian cities have grown wealthy through centuries of peace under Roman protection. Aquileia, ancient guardian of the northeastern approaches, becomes the first target of a campaign designed not merely to extract tribute, but to demonstrate that no Roman stronghold can resist determined assault by enemies who have learned to combine Hun mobility with imperial siege techniques. Aquileia's walls, strengthened over generations to withstand Germanic raids and civil wars, rise 40 feet above foundations cut from living rock. Her defenders, drawn from veteran legions and local militias, man battlements where ballistae and catapults command every approach. while archers with recurved bows position themselves at intervals that ensure overlapping fields of fire. The city's granaries bulge with provisions that could sustain siege for years, while her cisterns hold water drawn from mountain streams that no enemy can pollute. Yet these preparations, adequate against traditional enemies, prove insufficient when confronted by Attila's evolved methods of warfare. Hun engineers who studied Roman techniques during campaigns in the Balkans direct the construction of siege towers that rise higher than the city walls while protecting their crews from defensive fire. Captured Roman artillery specialists, working under threat of death for their families, position catapults that pound specific sections of fortification with mathematical precision designed to create exploitable breaches. The siege drags through 3 months of summer heat that turns the Po Valley into a furnace where disease breeds in stagnant water and corpses putrefy faster than burial details can dispose of them. Within Aquileia's walls, defenders watch their water supplies dwindle, while food rationing reduces proud citizens to skeletal shadows of their former selves. Outside those same walls, Attila's armies suffer from sickness that spreads through camps where tens of thousands of warriors live in conditions that would horrify civilized observers. Roman attempts to relieve Aquileia collapse when potential rescue armies discover that Hun cavalry controls every road leading to the besieged city. Swift raids that strike supply columns before they can reach their destinations demonstrate the Steppe understanding that victory often depends more on logistics than battlefield heroics. Italian cities that might have sent reinforcements instead focus on strengthening their own defenses, leaving Aquileia to face its doom in isolation. When the city finally falls, its destruction becomes legendary throughout the civilized world. Hun soldiers that pour through breached walls show no mercy to defenders who prolonged resistance beyond the point where surrender might have purchased survival. Buildings that housed families for generations become funeral pyres, while treasures accumulated over centuries disappear into baggage trains. The population that survives receives treatment designed to create refugees, whose tales will terrorize other cities into submission. News of Aquileia's fall spreads faster than Attila's troops, carried by survivors whose accounts of horrors witnessed create panic among populations who had considered themselves safe behind Roman frontiers. Milan, wealthy center of imperial administration, empties as its citizens flee southward while abandoning possessions they cannot carry. Padua's defenders melt away before scouts appear on the horizon, their courage evaporating like morning mist when confronted by evidence that no defense can guarantee survival. Attila's advance through the Po Valley becomes a procession of terror, punctuated by surrenders that purchase mercy through complete submission. Cities that open their gates find their populations spared, but their treasuries emptied, their young men conscripted into eastern armies, their craftsmen marched eastward to serve new masters. Those few that attempt resistance discover that the example of Aquileia was not merely empty threat, but promise of annihilation for any who dare oppose the king's will. Yet even as his troops sweep seemingly irresistibly toward Rome itself, elements beyond royal control begin to undermine the foundation of the Italian campaign. Disease that first appeared during the Aquileia siege spreads through steppe ranks with devastating efficiency, turning proud warriors into fever-racked invalids who can barely sit their horses. Famine follows pestilence, as supply lines stretched across hostile territory fail to provide adequate provisions for armies operating far from their homeland. Eastern horses, bred for endurance on grasslands where forage grows naturally abundant, begin to fail on Italian plains, where cultivated crops provide inadequate nutrition for animals accustomed to prairie grasses. The cavalry that forms the backbone of power loses effectiveness as mounts grow too weak for the sustained operations that traditional tactics require. Warriors who have never fought on foot find themselves facing enemies whose infantry training gives them advantages that traditions cannot match. Intelligence reports reaching headquarters reveal Roman preparations that threaten to transform the Italian adventure from triumph into disaster. General Aetius, architect of the coalition that halted expansion in Gaul, assembles troops in southern Italy, while Byzantine fleets carrying reinforcements sail toward ports that could cut lines of retreat. The strategic situation that seemed so favorable when the campaign began now presents challenges that may prove insurmountable. Environmental factors compound pressures, as unusual weather patterns create conditions that favor defenders over invaders. Summer rains that turn roads into impassable mud hinder mobility, while providing Italian cities with water supplies that enable extended resistance. Flooding that inundates low-lying areas eliminates grazing grounds needed to sustain horse herds, while creating barriers that force attacking battalions to follow predictable routes where ambushes become possible. Diplomatic intervention that arrives in the form of Pope Leo I represents more than mere religious mediation. It embodies the moral authority that the Roman Church has accumulated through centuries of service to populations abandoned by failing imperial administration. When Leo meets the king outside Rome's walls, he speaks not merely as spiritual leader, but as representative of values that transcend political boundaries and ethnic divisions. Contemporary accounts differ regarding what transpires during this legendary encounter. Some claim divine intervention manifests through miraculous signs that convince even pagan warriors of Christian truth. Others suggest more practical considerations: papal gold that supplements tribute payments, promises of future cooperation that benefit both temporal and spiritual authorities. Most likely, the meeting combines elements of both, creating an agreement that serves the immediate needs of all parties, while establishing precedents for future relations between wandering and settled civilizations. The decision to withdraw from Italy reflects not weakness, but strategic wisdom that recognizes when continued advance would destroy more than it could gain. Royal troops, weakened by disease and undermined by logistical failures, remain formidable enough to extract concessions from enemies, desperate to avoid further devastation. The agreement negotiated with papal representatives provides face-saving justification for retreat, while ensuring that withdrawal appears voluntary rather than forced by circumstances beyond control. The march northward through alpine passes becomes a race against winter storms that could trap weakened battalions in mountain defiles, where retreat becomes impossible and supply becomes completely dependent on what fighters can carry. Cavalry that entered Italy as conquering heroes struggle through snow-choked valleys as survivors whose primary goal has shifted from conquest to simple survival. Disease and exposure claim victims daily, while harsh weather eliminates the weak and strengthens the resolve of those who endure. Return to Pannonian strongholds provides opportunity for recovery and reorganization, but also reveals the extent to which Italian campaigns have weakened the foundation of power. Tribal levies that march south with confidence return as scattered remnants whose loyalty has been tested by hardships that traditions promised would bring glory rather than suffering. The aura of invincibility that once made the royal name a talisman of terror throughout the civilized world has been tarnished by evidence that even these armies face limitations imposed by geography, disease, and logistics. Wedding feast of 453 that celebrates marriage to the beautiful Ildiko should mark triumph over adversity and renewal of expansion plans that temporary setbacks have merely postponed. Instead, it becomes the setting for tragedy that will reshape European political development more decisively than any campaign. The great king, survivor of countless battles and architect of the largest empire in European history, dies suddenly during his wedding night from causes that remain disputed among contemporary sources. Medical explanations range from excessive alcohol consumption to internal bleeding caused by stress and overindulgence. Some accounts suggest choking on blood from nosebleeds that have plagued the ruler since his youth, while others hint at poisoning by enemies who recognize that royal death would solve problems that force alone cannot address. Most likely, the combination of physical strain, emotional pressure, and advancing age finally overwhelms a constitution that decades of campaign stress have gradually weakened. Discovery of the body the following morning creates panic among nobles, who understand that their leader's death without clear succession arrangements threatens to fragment the empire into competing factions. His sons, Elak, Dengizich, and Ernak, represent different approaches to leadership that reflect the diverse character of confederation. Their rivalry, initially contained by respect for their father's authority, explodes into open conflict that tears apart the political unity upon which supremacy depends. Elak, eldest son and designated heir, attempts to maintain traditional practices while governing territories that increasingly require settled administrative methods. His supporters include tribal conservatives who oppose accommodation with subject populations and favor return to pure steppe lifestyle that made their ancestors great. Yet his very conservatism alienates allied peoples whose cooperation has become essential for maintaining control over conquered territories. Dengizich advocates aggressive expansion that would restore momentum through renewed campaigns against enemies weakened by previous defeats. His faction attracts younger warriors frustrated by defensive policies that seem to betray traditions of conquest and plunder. However, his ambitions ignore logistical realities that make large-scale operations impossible without resources that the divided empire can no longer provide effectively. Ernak represents compromise between his brother's extreme positions, supporting limited expansion combined with administrative reforms that would integrate subject peoples more completely into society. His moderate approach attracts support from Germanic and Alan nobles, whose positions depend on continued dominance, but whose interests require stability rather than constant warfare. Unfortunately, moderation satisfies neither extreme faction, while failing to provide clear direction for dealing with immediate crises. Civil war that erupts following the funeral becomes a three-way struggle that destroys the coherence upon which power depends. Battalions that once fought as unified entities fragment into competing factions that battle each other with the same ferocity they once directed against external enemies. The spectacle of warriors destroying themselves provides encouragement to subject peoples who recognize opportunity in their masters' divisions. Germanic tribes that served as auxiliary troops in armies begin asserting independence as soon as news of royal death reaches their territories. Gepid King Ardaric, longtime ally turned rebel, rallies other tribal leaders around plans for coordinated rebellion that could eliminate overlordship entirely. His arguments emphasize that weakness creates unprecedented opportunity for Germanic peoples to reclaim territories their ancestors lost to conquest. Battle of Nidau in 454 becomes the decisive engagement that determines whether Dominion can survive its founder's death. Ardaric leads coalition troops that include Gepids, Rugians, Syri, and other Germanic tribes in assault against Elak's battalions that represent the last organized remnant of the empire. The irony that former allies now fight for the empire's destruction demonstrates how completely internal division has undermined the foundations of supremacy. Elec's death during this battle eliminates the last leader with legitimate claim to his father's full authority, while demonstrating that advantages disappear when unity breaks down under pressure of succession disputes. His surviving brothers, commanding reduced contingents and lacking territorial bases adequate for sustained resistance, become fugitives in lands their father once ruled absolutely. The rapid collapse from imperial dominance to desperate exile reveals how completely power depended on unified leadership under charismatic authority. Germanic victory at Nidau triggers general uprising throughout former territories, as subject peoples recognize that their opportunity for freedom may never come again. Cities that submitted reassert independence, while tribal groups that accepted overlordship repudiate agreements that no longer serve their interests. The political map of Central Europe undergoes transformation, as sudden and dramatic as any caused by conquest. Surviving fragments scatter across the continent seeking refuge wherever they can find hosts willing to accept defeated wanderers as allies rather than slaves. Some bands retreat eastward toward their ancestral steppes, carrying with them memories of European conquests that will inspire future leaders. Others integrate into Germanic societies, where their skills earn them positions as mercenaries and guards. A few groups survive as independent entities in remote territories, where geographic isolation protects them from enemies seeking revenge for past subjugation. Dengizic attempts to revive family fortunes through alliance with Eastern Roman authorities, who see opportunity in using remnants against other barbarian threats. His mercenary service provides temporary security for his followers, while demonstrating that skills retain value even after political power has vanished. However, imperial officials who employ him recognize that his ultimate ambitions threaten rather than serve Byzantine interests. Death of Dengizic in 469, when his severed head decorates Constantinople's walls as trophy of imperial victory over the last heir of legacy, marks the final end of political significance in European affairs. His death eliminates the possibility that charismatic leadership might reunite scattered fragments around renewed expansion plans. The name that once struck terror throughout the civilized world becomes historical curiosity rather than contemporary threat. Yet influence survives in forms less obvious but potentially more lasting than direct political control. Combat techniques developed during campaigns become standard practices among Germanic tribes that inherit their territories. Administrative methods, evolved for governing diverse populations, provide models for kingdoms that emerge from the empire's ruins. Most importantly, the precedent of success demonstrates that settled civilizations, however sophisticated, remain vulnerable to enemies who fight according to different rules. The stage is set for new actors in European political drama. Withdrawal creates power vacuum that Germanic kingdoms must fill, while dealing with challenges that conquest has left as permanent features of continental development. The lessons learned during decades of dominance will influence European development for centuries to come. Scattered remnants of Attila's empire drift eastward across the Carpathian Mountains like autumn leaves before winter storms, their passage marking the end of an age when a single Hun confederation commanded territories from the Volga to the Rhine. These survivors carry with them more than mere possessions. They bear the accumulated knowledge of conquest that transformed scattered steppe tribes into masters of half Europe. Behind them lie the ruins of cities they once ruled, the graves of enemies they defeated, and the memories of a time when Hun envoys spoke as equals to Roman emperors and Persian shahs. The roads that once carried tribute caravans toward Attila's court now witness the opposite flow as defeated warriors seek refuge in lands their fathers conquered. Hun cavalry that terrorized Gothic settlements now ride as refugees through those same regions, their weapons offered in mercenary service to former enemies who remember too well the devastation those same warriors once inflicted. The irony escapes none of the participants. Conquerors have become supplicants, masters have become servants, and the wheel of fortune has completed its inevitable revolution. Crimean strongholds that served as staging points for Western campaigns become final refuges for bands too proud to surrender their independence and too weak to reclaim their former dominance. These rocky peninsulas jutting into the Black Sea offer natural defenses that enable small groups to maintain autonomy, while the world around them reshapes itself according to new patterns of power. Here, among cliffs where seabirds nest and winds carry the salt tang of distant shores, the descendants of Modu Chanyu establish communities that will preserve Hun traditions for centuries to come. In hidden valleys where streams run clear and grass grows thick enough to sustain horse herds, these survivors recreate the world they lost on scales their reduced circumstances permit. Felt yurts rise again on ground that echoes with the ghosts of vanished greatness. Children learn to ride before they walk, just as their ancestors did on the eastern steppes, while grandmothers weave tales of Attila's conquests into patterns that will guide their descendants long after the storytellers themselves have joined their heroes in the eternal hunt. Germanic kingdoms that emerge from the collapse of Hun dominion discover that nomadic influences have become permanently embedded in their military traditions. Gepid warriors who fought as Attila's allies retain tactical knowledge that makes them formidable opponents when they establish independent realms in the Carpathian foothills. Their composite bows, forged according to Hun specifications, loose arrows with accuracy that Germanic enemies cannot match. Their cavalry charges, perfected through decades of service in nomadic armies, break infantry formations with efficiency that would make their former masters proud. Ostrogothic migrations that carry Theodoric's people toward Italy reflect strategic wisdom learned during years of Hun overlordship. These Teutonic warriors understand, as their ancestors did not, that successful conquest requires more than battlefield victory. Administrative skills acquired through observation of Hun governance enable them to rule Italian lands with competence that purely Germanic traditions could never have provided. The synthesis of nomadic flexibility with Gothic determination creates hybrid systems that serve both conquerors and conquered. Langobard expansion into regions abandoned by retreating Hun forces demonstrates how completely the political geography of Central Europe has been transformed. These Teutonic newcomers find not empty lands, but areas whose populations have learned to adapt to frequent changes of overlordship. The skills developed under Hun rule, diplomatic flexibility, military pragmatism, economic opportunism, enable rapid accommodation to new masters whose demands prove less onerous than those of their predecessors. Byzantine employment of Hun mercenaries reflects imperial recognition that steppe military skills retain value despite governmental collapse. Commanders who once fought against Attila's armies now recruit Hun veterans for campaigns against Persian enemies, who understand traditional Roman tactics but lack experience against steppe warfare methods. These mercenary bands, fighting under imperial eagles rather than horsetail standards, carry Hun expertise into conflicts that span from the Caucasus to the Syrian desert. Individual Hun leaders who accept Byzantine service discover that imperial courts offer opportunities for advancement that pure steppe society could never match. Warriors whose only heritage consisted of horses and weapons find themselves rewarded with estates and titles that provide security for their children and grandchildren. Yet success in imperial service requires cultural adaptations that gradually erode the very customs that made these men valuable as soldiers and administrators. Avar Confederation, that emerges in the mid-6th century, demonstrates how steppe organizational principles survive the collapse of specific governmental entities. These Turkic peoples, driven westward by pressures similar to those that once forced Hun migration, discover lands prepared for steppe occupation by centuries of Hun rule. The administrative networks, tribute systems, and combat techniques that Attila perfected provide templates that new conquerors adapt to their own requirements, with modifications that reflect changing circumstances rather than revolutionary innovations. When Avar Khans established their headquarters in the same Pannonian strongholds that once housed Hun courts, they inherit more than mere geography. Local populations that served steppe masters for generations understand the expectations and obligations that oversight entails. Teutonic nobles who survived the transition from Hun to Avar rule bring knowledge of governing techniques that enable smooth continuations of established practices. The lessons of accommodation learned during Hun dominance facilitate acceptance of new masters, whose methods differ in detail rather than fundamental principle. Slavic expansion that fills areas evacuated by retreating Teutonic tribes occurs within frameworks established during the Hun period. These agricultural peoples, previously confined to forest regions by more warlike neighbors, discover that conquest has eliminated many of the barriers that once restricted their movement. The skills they develop for surviving under Hun oversight, flexibility, adaptability, patient endurance, serve them well as they establish communities along the Danubian Basin and Balkan Peninsula. Archaeological evidence scattered across former Hun domains tells stories that written sources cannot preserve. Graves that contain weapons alongside Teutonic jewelry and Roman coins demonstrate the cultural fusion that characterized Attila's empire. Fortifications that combine steppe earthworks with Roman engineering techniques reveal the tactical innovation that made Hun armies nearly invincible during their period of expansion. Settlement patterns that blend mobility with agricultural stability show how completely conventional boundaries between wandering and sedentary lifestyles had broken down. Composite bows found in these archaeological sites represent more than mere weapons. They embody technological knowledge that transforms combat possibilities across post-Hun Europe. Teutonic smiths, who learned manufacturing techniques through observation of Hun craftsmen, continue producing these sophisticated weapons for armies that face enemies equipped with conventional equipment. The arrows designed for these bows, with their specialized points and precisely calculated flights, carry death across distances that make ordinary archery obsolete. Metalworking innovations that spread across Europe during the Hun period survive in techniques that influence weapon production for centuries. The folding methods that create steel blades sharper than razors become standard practices in workshops from the Rhine to the Dnieper. Armor designs that balance protection against mobility inspire modifications in Teutonic equipment that reflect lessons learned through bitter experience against enemies. The marriage of Eastern metallurgy with Western needs produces hybrid technologies that surpass their separate origins. Religious synthesis that characterized Hun governance continues influencing spiritual development across their former domains. Christian communities that survived rule carry within their practices elements of steppe shamanism that enrich their theological understanding while maintaining orthodox doctrine. Pagan beliefs that accommodated Hun spiritual practices develop syncretic forms that persist long after their creators have vanished from significance. The religious tolerance that Attila practiced becomes precedent for policies that enable diverse populations to coexist peacefully under unified rule. Administrative practices developed for governing multi-ethnic populations provide models for kingdoms that inherit Hun domains. The flexible hierarchies that enabled leaders to rule Goths, Gepids, Alans, and Romans simultaneously inspire governmental innovations that serve medieval development. Tax collection systems that adapted steppe tribute customs to settled agricultural needs become foundations for royal finance across the post-Roman world. The diplomatic protocols that facilitated negotiations between wandering and settled civilizations establish precedents that influence international relations for generations. Legal customs that emerged from Hun governance reflect the practical necessities of ruling diverse populations according to different customary laws. The court systems that applied appropriate justice to subjects simultaneously demonstrate flexibility that purely Teutonic or Roman institutions could not match. These hybrid legal frameworks, tested through decades of practical application, provide stability for areas that undergo frequent changes of control during the chaotic centuries following Hun collapse. Marriage customs that developed during the Hun period influenced social practices across their former domains. The alliances created through royal marriages between rulers and Teutonic princesses establish precedents for diplomatic marriages that shape dynastic arrangements for centuries. The cultural exchange that results from these unions creates families whose children inherit practices from multiple civilizations, producing leaders equipped to govern diverse populations, with understanding that purely ethnic rulers could not achieve. Combat methods that spread across Europe during Hun campaigns become permanent features of medieval warfare. The coordinated cavalry charges that armies perfected influence Teutonic tactical development in ways that persist long after their teachers have departed. Infantry formations that learn to counter mobility through disciplined cooperation become standard practices for armies that face mounted enemies. The siege techniques that enabled Hun forces to reduce fortified cities inspire modifications in defensive architecture that reflect lessons learned through direct experience. Linguistic influences that result from Hun dominance leave traces in languages spoken across their former domains. Teutonic dialects that incorporate steppe vocabulary for combat terms, horse equipment, and administrative concepts preserve evidence of cultural impact that written sources often ignore. Latin texts that adopt Hun terminology for describing warfare, diplomacy, and governance demonstrate how completely practices had penetrated civilized consciousness. The survival of these linguistic borrowings provides evidence for cultural exchange that transcends mere dominance. Trade networks that developed under Hun oversight continue functioning long after their creator's disappearance. Commercial routes that connected Asian steppes with markets maintain importance for merchants who understand that profitable exchange transcends temporary arrangements. The caravan practices that enabled safe passage through lands become standard procedures for international commerce during the medieval period. Markets that flourished under Hun protection develop customs of tolerance and accommodation that serve diverse trading communities for centuries. Artistic practices that emerged from the fusion of steppe and settled cultures influence creative expression across post-Hun Europe. Metalworkers who learned animal decoration techniques from craftsmen continue producing objects that combine functionality with steppe aesthetic sensibilities. Textile production that incorporates Asian silk with wool creates patterns that proclaim the international character of post-Roman civilization. The synthesis of artistic approaches that Hun patronage encouraged becomes foundation for medieval decorative arts. Educational practices that developed in Hun courts, where interpreters mastered multiple languages and scribes recorded decisions in various scripts, influence intellectual development across their former domains. The multilingual competence that governance required becomes model for diplomatic and commercial education in kingdoms that must deal with diverse populations and foreign contacts. Schools that preserve this linguistic knowledge maintain capabilities for international communication that purely local institutions could not provide. Cultural memory that preserves Hun achievements takes many forms across the regions they once ruled. Epic poems that celebrate Attila's conquests inspire later compositions that adapt themes to heroic legends. Chronicles that record Hun campaigns provide historical frameworks for understanding development during the crucial centuries of Roman collapse. The legends that transform historical figures into mythical heroes demonstrate the psychological impact that dominance had on consciousness. Yet the most lasting Hun legacy may lie not in specific practices or institutions, but in the demonstration that arrangements remain fluid rather than fixed. Their success in creating multi-ethnic confederations that transcended boundaries provides precedents for later empire builders who face similar challenges of governing diverse populations. The techniques they developed for adapting flexibility to settled administrative requirements inspire innovations that serve medieval kingship across the continent. By the 6th century's close, direct Hun influence has vanished from affairs, yet their impact continues shaping continental development in ways both obvious and subtle. The kingdoms that inherit their domains employ combat techniques perfected through experience, while governing populations whose expectations have been shaped by decades of steppe rule. The trade routes that connected east and west retain importance for merchants who understand that profitable exchange requires accommodation between different cultural approaches. Perhaps most significantly, the Hun period demonstrates that civilization develops through interaction rather than isolation, that strength comes from synthesis rather than purity, and that the boundaries between wandering and settled lifestyles remain permeable to peoples with sufficient vision and determination. These lessons, learned through direct experience during the centuries of Hun dominance, become permanent features of consciousness. The echoes of their passage continue reverberating through halls where new kings hold court, across battlefields where their tactical innovations determine victory, and in the memories of peoples who discovered that the world contains possibilities their ancestors never imagined. The name of the Huns may fade from contemporary significance, but their influence on development proves as enduring as the stones they carved and the customs they established during their brief but transformative dominance of half the continent.